Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. I'm your host, Brooke Mitchell, and today's topic is wombats and wild frames, your guide to Australian nature photography with expedition leader Mike Hillman. Thank you so much for being here today, Mike. Over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Brooke, and welcome everyone. Today we're going to get a chance to talk about one of my absolute favorite topics, or two of them rather, photography and Australia and its unique wildlife. Wombats and wild frames is our presentation today. But to start off, just to introduce myself a little bit further so you know exactly who you're learning from today. My name is Mike Hillman. I'm the Photo Expeditions Director for Natural Habitat Adventures. I've been guiding with the company for 8 years. But recently in the last year have been working specifically to help increase the awareness and increase the success of our photo expeditions out in the field. So make sure our guests are getting the photos that they're hoping for and getting to see some amazing things along the way. Like I said, I've been guiding with the company for 8 years throughout North America as well as internationally. Guided in Alaska. Just a couple weeks ago, I got back from the Grand Canyon after leading a desert Southwest photo expedition. I've also led trips up to see the polar bears in Canada, over to Greenland, down into Yellowstone and Grand Teton, in Maine to photograph the fall color season, Florida during our nature safaris there, as well as, of course, helping start the Australia trips back in 2022. Throughout all that, I've had a lot of fun being able to learn and teach our guests how to photograph in these really fantastic places. So to continue along, to talk a little bit about our outline for today, first, I want to do a little celebration for International Wombat Day, as well as an overview of NetHab's Australian trips. Then I want to change things up a little bit. I'm going to actually switch off my presentation and show you my camera bag as I would have packed it to go to Australia, pull out the pieces and talk about each one. And then finally go through some of my favorite locations in Australia that we visit during our trips and give you some different tips and techniques how to be an excellent photographer and be successful out in the field. So let's get started. So as Brooke mentioned, today is in fact International Wombat Day, October 22nd. And you may not have realized that you were celebrating International Wombat Day by tuning into the webinar today, but it's a cool opportunity to celebrate one of Australia's unique wildlife. They set it up to be in kind of mid-October at the beginning of the planting season because wombats are herbivores eating a lot of vegetation. It just makes perfect sense. So to give you a little background on wombats, there's actually 3 different species of wombats. There's the northern hairy-nosed wombat, the southern hairy-nosed wombat, and the bare-nosed wombat, also known as the common wombat, which is the most common of the 3 species. And their closest cousin is the koala. So you can see I've got a picture of a koala down there on the bottom left. You can see some of that family resemblance, if you will. Whereas the koalas live up in the trees eating vegetation, our wombats live down on the ground, grazing on the grasses and other types of vegetation. And they're not as small as you might think. They can be over 2 feet in length and anywhere between 44 to 70 pounds. They can be pretty big. They look like they're just all rotund, but they actually are packed with a lot of muscle. They're very strong creatures for their size. And you can see here from this little video of them grazing away. They're constantly eating vegetation, particularly a lot of grasses. They spend a lot of their time with their head down grazing along because grasses themselves aren't very nutritious in their own right. So you have to eat a lot of them and digest them efficiently in order to get nutrition out of them to survive. And that's exactly what wombats do. Now, one really cool adaptation they've got to help them with eating grasses is like rodents, like say the beaver, that have their teeth constantly growing so that when they're chewing through vegetation, they're able to continue chewing without their teeth fully wearing away. Because that vegetation, like grasses, have a lot of silica in them and they would dull teeth very, very quickly if they don't continue to grow. And wombats have that same adaptation. The only marsupial that has this, where as they're chewing and as that vegetation's grinding their teeth down, the teeth continue to grow just like a rodent's would. And one of my favorite facts about them is actually about what comes out the other end. Unlike just about any other animal in the world, wombats have cube-shaped excrement, cube-shaped poo. And The reason behind this has to do with some research that's just coming out about how their intestines actually squeeze from the sides, squeeze from the top, squeeze from the sides to try to get all the moisture and all the nutrition out of that matter before it comes out the other end, and it comes out in cube shape. But on top of that, it actually has an additional benefit, which I think is the main reason for it. And that's that researchers, when studying this, realized that wombats have an excellent sense of smell, and they use their smell to understand their environment, in particular, communicate with other wombats. And so, if their feces were to come out, and if it was round shaped, and they live in oftentimes very rolling hill, grassy, bumpy, rocky areas, those their feces can their scat can fall down, scatter away, and it doesn't stay where they want it to be, where they can send their chemical signal announcing their territory or their breeding status, those sorts of things. And so by having it cube shaped, in honor of International Wombat Day, I made a plate of cube shaped brownies. And by having the little cube shape right there, and as they come out, they essentially stack on top of each other. You can see in my camera right there. They stay put, which means that when our wombat puts up the signpost of their territory using their scat, that announces and it doesn't roll away, and the wombats that come along can see it and then continue on to find their own burrow system somewhere else. Pretty unusual, but I think worth noting with our wombat. Now, they are a burrowing animal. So, unlike the koalas that are up in the trees, they burrow down into the ground in these massive burrow systems that can have upwards of 15 entrances. So, when you look across the landscape and you see all these holes, likely in Australia, those holes are all connected together as this big burrow system that can have a radius between all those entrances of about 500 feet, which is impressive. Now, another really interesting fact about wombats is they've evolved their own door. So you can imagine for an animal that's 2 feet long, 60 pounds, they make a fairly big hole. A hole big enough, a lot of predators might be able to get inside. Think dingoes or wild dogs and cats that can be predators for them. And so, what they've actually evolved is on the back of their rump, they've got this very tough tissue area that acts like a pad or a door that they put at the very entrance of their burrow, so that if a predator were to try to get in there, it actually can't get past that tough tissue pad, and helps protect the rest of them and keeps that predator out of the burrow system, which is pretty impressive. In addition, like other marsupials, they have a pouch. But you can imagine if you're a burrowing animal and you're digging and digging, and your pouch is right here at your belly, you're going to get dirt filling up your pouch. And it wouldn't be very fun for your Joey, your baby. And so their pouch is actually evolved to face backwards. So as dirt's flying backwards, it's not getting into the pouch. You can zoom in here to see this little Joey sticking out the back end. Keeps it clean from the dirt, but you have to imagine if that Joey looks up, maybe not the best view out there in Australia. Now, something really cool about the conservation that wombats have actually helped with is that during 2019 and 2020, when we had these significant wildfires in Australia, what was interesting is actually scientists were noticing that a lot of animals were taking refuge in those extensive burrow systems that wombats dig. Now, a lot of people thought, oh, the wombats are walking them in and saving everyone. Likely not the case, but the fact that their burrow system is so extensive, it made it easy for a lot of animals to squat inside that burrow system, wait for the fires to pass overhead, and then safely down underneath, and then come out after it was safe. And so wombats did inadvertently a lot of work to save a lot of Australian wildlife during that significant wildfire season. So just wanted to take a moment and celebrate our wombats. I'll talk a little bit more about wombat photography as we get towards the end, but welcome and enjoy International Wombat Day. So to get on a different track here to talk a little bit more about Australia and some of the trips that we do, really want to start off by just giving you an idea of how big Australia is. So when we talk about these trips, how far away are we talking about some of these locations being? Essentially, Australia is the same size as the United States. Tasmania, which is that red island where you can see the word Hobart down below, that's about the same size as West Virginia. So just to give you an idea of some of the places that we're visiting. It's a big country, and there's a lot to see in that country. But Australia has 3 different trips that we run to different parts of Australia. There's Australia South, which is a trip I helped start that does Tasmania, a place called Kangaroo Island, which we'll show pictures of here shortly, as well as some other locations. We have a trip to Australia North, which is kind of our outback trip. It's the Red Centre, it's Uluru, it's the Gone Train up to Darwin and the Kimberleys. It's a very fascinating trip. And then we have what we call the Ultimate Australia, which combines Australia South with some really interesting stuff up in the north. Not the north sections that we see on our Australia North trip, but they go to places like the Daintree Rainforest and the Great Barrier Reef, which is spectacular. So here to look at them a little bit closer, here's our Australia South trip. You can see on the map there on the bottom left, the different points that we visit. Kangaroo Island, then along the Victoria Coast, either depending on the time of year, we've got the Great Ocean Road, or early next year, we are also doing trips that go to the Grampians, which is a mountain range in that general vicinity, as well as checking out Tasmania. And this is a fantastic trip. It's a 2-week long trip, and it gives you a good taste of Australia. And in particular, it shows you the wildlife that you think of when you think of Australia. It shows you the koalas and the kangaroos and the wallabies and the wombats, as well as some just stunning landscapes that we see in places like Kangaroo Island and Tasmania. Now, Australia North, you can see it starts off in Sydney. So that's our only trip that includes Sydney as part of the itinerary. You get a chance to see some of the beautiful city sites there. But then you're going to make your way towards the red center of Australia to the outback, into places like Uluru and Alice Springs. Uluru used to be known as Ayers Rock, if you're familiar with that. It's that big rock in the upper left corner of those pictures there. You also take the Gone Train, which is a historic and scenic train ride north up towards Kakadu National Park, which is one of the largest national parks in Australia, and then finish off by checking out Darwin as well as the Kimberley region, which is this fantastic geologic wondrous area. You can think of it a little bit like the American Southwest as far as a lot of these interesting geology, the rocks and canyons and river systems and things like that. But Australia puts its own spin on it, and there's a whole host of culture that's situated behind places like this. And lastly, my personal favorite Australia trip that we run, which is the Ultimate Australia trip. So this combines some of those beautiful features of the Australia South, like Kangaroo Island, like Tasmania, but it adds some others. Goes to a different portion of the outback that we call the Flinders Range, just north of Adelaide. But we also get a chance to see the Great Barrier Reef by staying on an island in the reef system and then swimming almost literally right out your doorstep. And then as well as check out another one of my favorite places, which is the Daintree Rainforest, considered the oldest rainforest in the world, and has some very unique creatures as part of it. So from there, I want to talk a little bit about what I'm going to pack when I think about going on one of these trips with regards to my camera bag. There's a lot of resources online for each of these trips when it comes to the general packing list. But as a photographer, what am I bringing along with me so that I have what I need to photograph all that is Australia's splendor? So I'm going to switch off of my presenter screen and show you my webcam and actually go through my physical bag here. So let's do that here. All right, so you should see my full screen right now. Let me put that down so you can see a little better. Beautiful. So let's take a look at my actual camera bag here. This is the bag that I've taken on every Australia trip that I go on. This happens to be just an Osprey shuttle or porter backpack that I've outfitted with an f-stop insert. If you're familiar with them, it's a company that has these different camera bag inserts that you can put into any bag. So you really have the option to turn any bag you want into a camera bag. I like this bag in particular because it's bulky but small enough. It fits under most seats. It fits overhead in a lot of the airplanes, as well as it doesn't look like a camera bag, which adds its own level of security. And typically, stewardesses and things like that don't have us check this bag because it doesn't look like a camera bag. So first off, I always bring my laptop. As a guide, of course, I bring my laptop for a lot of reasons, but as a photographer, you want to be able to potentially edit your own photos out in the field, or at the very least, take your photos from your memory cards, dump them onto an external hard drive so that you can keep using those memory cards over the course of the trip. So I bring that with me. Then from there, of course, I'm going to bring the camera. So I shoot Sony. In particular, this is a Sony A1, and on it I've got a lens which is the 200 to 600. This is my standard wildlife lens that I use on a lot of trips. I will say that while I have the 200 to 600, if you have something more in the range of a 100 to 400, that's going to work just as well in Australia. That's one of the things I love about Australia is, to be honest, the wildlife photography is kind of easy. The animals are generally a little bit less fearful of people. You can get closer, you can get some phenomenal shots with a shorter lens than the 200 to 600. But this is my lens that I carry on most of my trips, so it's my trusty lens I bring with me. Now, it's important to note that I've got my camera on my wildlife lens, and this is actually for a purpose. That I always keep my camera on my wildlife lens, and then I switch to a landscape lens when I see landscape opportunities. And that's super important because something I learned early on in photographing was that wildlife moves, landscapes don't. So you want to always be prepared for wildlife, for that bird that might be on that branch for just 10, 15 seconds. So having your camera on your wildlife lens ready to go makes a lot more sense than taking a picture of the mountain because the mountain's not moving. You can switch off your wildlife lens, put on your landscape lens, and get that shot without worry about missing the shot. All right, then from there, in addition to that big wildlife lens, I've got my landscape lens. What I recommend in Australia is something of kind of a mid-range to wide angle zoom. In particular, this one right here is a 24 to 70. Works beautiful for just about every application of landscape photography that I see out there. And in fact, I've even used it on some wildlife in some aspects of the trip because, again, you can get pretty close. Then from there, I've got rain gear for your camera. Super important, especially if you're in places like the Daintree rainforest. As a wildlife watcher and of course as a guide, I've also got my binoculars with me. But you may not need those, especially if you've got a camera with a long lens. You can use it a bit like binoculars. Then from there, super important, is I always bring with me some spare lens caps. Lens caps occasionally fall off. They're one of the easiest things to lose as far as camera gear. And I want to make sure I keep my lenses protected throughout the entire trip. So I bring a couple spare lens caps, one for each camera or camera lens, so that if I have an issue, if I lose it, I've got one extra. Then from there, very important is a cleaning kit, especially if you're in places like the Red Center, the Outback. Those areas are incredibly dusty. We'll get into that in a little bit. But that cleaning kit's going to be super helpful. And so things I've got with me, of course, are your traditional lens cleaning solution. You've got your little lens cleaning cloths. I have one of those air blowers to blow the dust off. That's usually how I start with cleaning my lens, is blow the dust off, then brush some of it off, and then wipe it off. Use one of these lens safe brushes. That's super helpful. In there, I'm going to have a spare battery as well as spare memory cards. And a little something that I have been doing as well is like an old camping toothbrush or an old toothbrush I bring with me because this works beautifully at brushing the dust and dirt off the body of the camera. You don't want to use this on the lens per se, but this is very good at getting your camera clean in general. So I bring that with me. Then from there, of course, you're going to be bringing a memory card reader. You're going to be bringing, hopefully, a hard drive that you can put your photos on. In Australia, you're going to want to take a lot of photos. Being able to dump them onto an external hard drive is super helpful. Of course, your camera battery charger. And don't forget, if you're traveling from the United States or from other parts of the world, you're going to want to have some sort of adapter that you can plug your electronics into to charge them. So make sure you've got one, if not several adapters, so you can do that. Now, if you're going to a place like the Great Barrier Reef, I don't do as much underwater photography using my Sony A1 in a housing. What I found is much more successful is using something like a GoPro. So I've got a GoPro with me as well as a GoPro stick, selfie stick, if you will. Super important with a selfie stick is that it extends pretty far. That's super important because your big body scares a lot of fish and other wildlife. So that little GoPro stick sticking out far enough that you can reach out and video that animal up close without spooking it. That's super helpful. Now, a little pro tip with the GoPro, with the camera, and other electronics is I travel with the batteries outside of those electronics so that in the means of traveling or moving around, if the power button gets bumped or something like that, it doesn't run through my battery life. So make sure you travel with them together, but unplugged so you don't have to worry about that. But that's my camera bag. That's what I've taken. All that here is essentially what I've taken on every Australia trip that I've run and been quite successful. And you'll see here all the images from here on out are from my camera doing this exact setup. So I'm going to switch back to my presenter mode. Give me 1 second.
Hey, Mike, while you're switching over, I'm getting a lot of awesome questions about your brand of pack and the inserts. Could you by
Yeah,
chance repeat what those were?
yeah, of course. Yeah, since we've got it right here. So this particular bag, you can put it right there, is an Osprey. So Osprey bag, this is what's called a Porter 46 liter. And the brand of the insert, I'll show, put some of the stuff back so it looks a little messy right now, but essentially the insert looks like this. And I've literally just put the insert inside the bag. You can see the actual edge right there. So that is the insert for F-Stop is the company, F-Stop. So I particularly love them because you don't have to buy a dedicated camera bag. You can buy a bag that you like and then add the camera bag insert through F-Stop. The key is the way I set that one up actually is I brought my bag that I liked to a camera store that was selling F-Stop gear. And so I was able to just try different sizes of the bags that they put out to see which one worked best. Perfect. All right, so I'll go ahead and continue on with my talk here and kind of go through each location and what we've got as tips and techniques for each location. So first, I want to start off with one of my personal favorite places in Australia in general, which is Kangaroo Island. It's a stunning landscape with very interesting wildlife and a lot of the wildlife that we think of when we think of Australia. So when our groups visit Kangaroo Island, there's a few things that we're thinking about that's part of our itinerary. One is we're looking for, of course, kangaroos on Kangaroo Island. They're very interesting to get a chance to see out there, but interestingly enough, the other critter that we're spending a lot of our time looking for in Kangaroo Island is actually the koala. There's a very good sized population of koalas on Kangaroo Island, and oftentimes they're pretty easy to spot, and so we have a good chance of finding them and getting some photographs. In addition to that, we visit a sea lion colony where we get to photograph them out along the beautiful shoreline of Kangaroo Island, as well as check out the national park there and some of the rugged coastline that's a part of it. We even get a chance to see a winery, do a bit of a wine tasting that's there on Kangaroo Island. And as we're traveling through these landscapes, looking for this wildlife and seeing this interesting area, we're also learning about the bushfires from 2019 into 2020. Kangaroo Island in particular was hit pretty hard. We've seen this beautiful resurgence and regrowth and renewal off of when that happened, but there's a lot of story behind that, and it adds to the rich history that is Kangaroo Island. So let's talk photo tips and techniques. So generally in Kangaroo Island, we're thinking about the two mainstays of nature photography, which is wildlife and landscape photography. So to give you some different tips and techniques, when you're in a place like Flinders Chase National Park, which is this beautiful coastline part of Kangaroo Island, you're just going to see all these interesting rock formations and coastlines. And one of the things I suggest is to move around, try some different perspectives. Walk up to where some folks may be taking pictures, but move and try some different angles and see what speaks to you. In particular, what this area is called Remarkable Rocks, and these beautiful rock structures that are about the same size as people, if not a little taller. You can get some really interesting angles by moving around and checking them out. You also have in Kangaroo Island, because of this rugged coastline, but still beautiful landscape, is you get these waterways that where shipping channels would have gone historically, and still in some cases do today, there are lighthouses. We have at least a couple lighthouses that we visit as part of the itinerary. This one's the Cape Willoughby Lighthouse. And something to take note of is if you're photographing with a wide angle lens like my 24 to 70, if you get very close to the lighthouse and try to take an image, what you'll notice is that the image will be kind of warped because you have to spread your wide angle out all the way to get all of that in frame. It actually starts bending the light. And what you'll notice is if you look towards the top of the lighthouse in your image, you'll see that the railings will be warped inwards, or the light won't be quite straight. So you want to make sure that you're reducing that distortion as much as possible. What that means is you back up, maybe use a little bit longer. So towards the 70 of my 24 to 70 and standing a little bit further back, you get the lighthouse in the landscape and you get a perfectly straight lighthouse, which is what you're hoping for. So that's just a basic tip on lighthouse photography. When it comes to the wildlife, particularly lean on your guides a little bit, but you can do your own sleuthing to try to find koalas up in the trees. You're looking typically at the eucalyptus, which the guides will tell you which trees are which, but you'll also want to look to where the branches meet. With the koalas in particular, they spend a lot of their time sleeping, and so what they'll be doing is actually in the little crook of two branches, two pieces of the log, and they're going to be curled up in there, and oftentimes they'll be sleeping. And so you're looking for that gray lump in between the branches is a good way to try to find them. Then carefully approach and then see maybe if those animals are active enough, you might be able to get a view. Oftentimes your first few images of koalas will just be them all tucked up and sleeping, but you see enough of them that hopefully you get one awake and looking around so you can get a beautiful portrait like this one here. Now, one of, I think, the most iconic shots of a marsupial in Australia is that mom with the joey sticking out of the pouch. And so as you see, here's a Tamar wallaby hopping around. You're looking for that pouch a bit distended. It'll look like that kangaroo is very, very full from a big meal, but of course that's the joey inside the pouch. So if you start to see more and more of these individuals, you can start picking out which ones are the mothers, which ones have joeys, and then those are the ones you want to follow and try to get some interesting photos of. Oftentimes, as they're hopping around, they may pause for a second, look back at you, and that might be the moment that a joey sticks its head out. So those are the individuals you want to look for with those bigger pouches, and then hopefully you get an image like this with that little joey sticking out. Now, another good principle of wildlife photography in general is to watch your background. This particular image of a Kangaroo Island kangaroo, I was standing a little bit taller, and when I was doing that, it was mostly just grass behind this kangaroo. So I crouched down a little bit lower so I could get the water of the coastline behind, so you get this nice clean edge around the kangaroo. And so that's a good thing to think about when it comes to photographing animals, is you want to make sure that their background is nice and clean so it doesn't muddy up their shape. And so it's easier to tell for your audience that you're looking at the kangaroo or whatever wildlife it might be. So when you do all those techniques, you get some really fantastic images. Here we've got this kangaroo out in this beautiful landscape of orange lichens and yellow flowers, those sorts of things. We also go to the Australian sea lion colony, and during certain times of year, you can see the sea lion pups. So this is just right off the side of the sidewalk as we're walking past and towards the shoreline. You can get some very cute images. There you go. Very cool critter here. Of course, when you think about Australia, you oftentimes think about reptiles, and we do get to see some on the trip, hopefully. This one is the Rosenberg's goanna that's cruising around that sea lion colony. All right, so that's just a little taster of Kangaroo Island. Let's move on to another one of my favorite locations, which is the Daintree Rainforest. And right next to it, and part of that little excursion that we go through, is the Atherton Tablelands, which is just a little bit higher up, but still kind of a drier rainforest environment, versus the rainforest of the Daintree, which is a bit wetter, a bit more humid. So in this landscape, we're doing a number of different things. One, we're taking an Aboriginal walk through the landscape. We've got an Aboriginal guy that'll teach us about the traditional uses, a lot of the plants and wildlife in that area, and learn a little bit more about the cultural history behind the world's oldest rainforest. We're also looking for the one of the bigger birds in Australia, which is our cassowary, our kind of rainbow emu, if you will. I'll show some pictures. I get a beautiful shot of them in just a minute. We also visit some different sanctuaries. That's one thing I really enjoy about Australia trips is we visit these different rescues and rehabilitation sites so we can learn how Australian people are taking care of the Australian wildlife. This right here is the bat hospital where we get to see some of the fruit bats and the microbats and how they're being cared for and released back out into the wild. We're looking for some interesting critters like the Boyd's forest dragon, which is that iguana-looking lizard on the tree trunk. Looking for kangaroos in the trees of all places. Look for my personal favorite Australian animal, which is the platypus. And we even take a river cruise looking for saltwater crocodiles right from the river itself. So some tips and techniques when it comes to rainforest and river photography. First, when you're in such a dense jungle environment like the Daintree, you need to be thinking about how best to focus. I'm sure you've had this issue before where you're trying to take a picture, and as you're taking a picture and you're holding down the button or trying to take a picture with your phone, that autofocus is all over the place. It's focusing on a branch, it's focusing on a leaf, a little bit of light dazzling up through the trees. It can be very difficult to get the focus on what you want, which is the animal you're trying to take a picture of. So if you have the ability with your camera, I strongly suggest during this portion of the trip to put on what's called spot focus, or depending on your camera, maybe known as single point focus. And what that'll look like is this. You're telling your camera a little tiny speck on the screen what to focus on. So it can ignore all those leaves that are in the way, all the branches, and you get the focus on what you're hoping for, which in this case is the eye of the cassowary moving through the dense jungle. So be sure to know how to do spot focus before you get into these thick areas. Now, another thing to think about is what's called exposure compensation. This is very useful because not always is the wildlife going to be on the ground. You're in the rainforest. Oftentimes the animals are in the tree. This right here is called a tree kangaroo. I've been lucky enough to see them on the ground, but usually where I see them is way up in the tree. And they're related to the kangaroos you're used to seeing in other parts of Australia, but these kangaroos hop from branch to branch and spend most of their life up in these trees. And so it can be difficult to get an image of them because you're shooting what will be a dark animal and then that bright sky behind that's filtering through the leaves of the tree. So this is where exposure compensation comes into play. So if you look at your camera, either through a point and shoot or even one of the bigger cameras like the mirrorless Sony A1 that I have, you'll notice a spot that'll have a plus or minus. And that's what's the exposure compensation. Meaning that your camera is doing its own work to figure out how bright the image should be. But when it looks at something challenging like this, it may not know necessarily the best way to expose or brighten up the image. So you can tell it by moving the dial to either get a little bit brighter, +1, +2, +3, or to get a little bit darker, -1, -2, -3, in order to get an image that will look the best for the circumstances that you've got. Invariably, you're going to have a bright sky, you're going to have a dark animal, but by taking it into Lightroom or some other editing software, you can fix the image and get a decent enough image of that tree kangaroo way up at the top of the canopy of the rainforest trees. Now, when you're out on the river, this is another opportunity where that spot focus can come into play. This is a saltwater croc that was actually up on the shoreline in amongst the mangroves. So I was able to focus on just the eye so that it wasn't going to focus on the rest of those mangrove leaves and roots. Now, conversely, when you're in the water, on the boat, you're photographing hopefully these saltwater crocs swimming by. A lot of folks, when they think about wildlife photography, you want to think about getting your eye on the perspective of the animal. That's usually the most powerful composition. But with a crocodile or other animals that sit at the very surface of the water, if you do that, you lose most of the animal. So sit up a little bit higher, aim a little bit further down, and you get a beautiful shot of the crocodile swimming by. This is one of the bigger males that live on that particular stretch of the waterway. Interestingly enough, saltwater crocs oftentimes have territories, and big males like this one named Scarface is well known in that area. Now, when you're thinking about the rainforest, you're also thinking about other small critters as well, like tree snakes, the Queen Alexandria birdwing, which is a beautiful butterfly, or the Boyd's forest dragon, which is a lot of fun to try to find. They like to hide on the trunks of trees, and so you have to literally scan at eye level looking for these lizards as they move around. They're about anywhere between 2 to 3 feet long, depending on some big ones, and a long tail. And bird life in the Daintree is fantastic. This is a practicing juvenile Victoria's rifle bird. They stick their wings out like that and do a bit of dancing to impress the females. And so I suspect this little fella was practicing that before he gets the beautiful black and blue plumage that he'll get as an adult. And of course, some other interesting birds are cassowary, which is going to be our biggest prize in the Daintree rainforest. We're going to spend time looking for that, as well as some other interesting wildlife. This particular one is a metallic starling, which nests communally, and this particular individual happened to be looking straight at me, right down the barrel of my camera lens. All right, moving from the Daintree, another fantastic spot is the Great Barrier Reef, of course, the most famous reef in the world. And where we'll stay to check out the Great Barrier Reef is a place called Lady Elliot Island, which you can see all of right in that image right there. You can see the landing strip down the center. Of course, we're flying there via a plane, but an hour's flight from where we take off on the mainland to get to Lady Elliot, all the while looking at the coastline of Australia, looking for wildlife like whales swimming along underneath us, and you might even get a chance to see a manta ray as you're landing on Lady Elliot as they're swimming around. This, of course, is Great Barrier Reef, so you want to spend a lot of time in the water if you can, getting in to do some snorkeling, look for sea turtles, tropical fish, and sharks and rays. Those are all things that are possible from Lady Elliot Island. We also have opportunities to learn from the biologists and educators that are there at Lady Elliot. So we'll have time for talks, explore the island through the forest that's there. And in addition to the wildlife under the water, Lady Elliot boasts thousands of breeding seabirds. And so there's a cacophony of birds flying around, nesting, squawking, looking at you as you get out of your room each morning, head out to the mess hall, then go out for a snorkel or a walk. There's just so much to look at when you're at Lady Elliot Island. So when we talk tips and techniques, I'm thinking about in Lady Elliot, underwater and bird photography. So with underwater photography, I'm playing some videos right here. I suspect with the webinar software, it may be a bit on the choppy side, which is fine. Still talks a little bit to the point of what I'm getting at. But number one thing when it comes to snorkeling and looking for wildlife is to look around. Most people I see will look straight down as they're swimming along to look at the coral beneath, which is beautiful, but you want to be able to look around in the water column as well. If I hadn't done that, I would have missed this reef squid swimming by, which is this kind of technicolor of changing colors as it swims by. So always keep your head on the swivel, look left, look right, look down, in order to try to find all the interesting animals that live on the Great Barrier Reef. Then from there, this one's very important, near dear to my heart as a guide, is mind yourself. Mind your surroundings, mind your fins, mind how you swim. When you're in a place like the Great Barrier Reef, in, what might I add, probably one of the most pristine parts of the Great Barrier Reef, around Lady Elliot Island, you want to be making sure that you're taking care to be a good steward of that landscape while you're visiting. So being able to know how to settle in and float, as well as just gently kick or do a lot of swimming with just your hands. You can have more control over to make sure you're not bumping up any corals or messing with anything along the way. That's going to be super important. And also move slowly. This is super important because you're going to spook a lot of animals if you're splashing around a lot, you're moving around a lot. The less movement you have and the slower you are, a lot more wildlife is willing and more comfortable to swim past you, so you can get some really interesting footage with your GoPro or your underwater camera. In particular, this shark right here, they have what's called electroreception, meaning they can sense electricity in the water, which our muscles twitching is electricity. It gives off electrical signals. And so if you're moving around a whole lot, they can sense that, they can see you moving a lot, and they'll scoot off in the other direction. But if you move slowly and calmly, those animals will swim right past you and you get much better experience because of it. And another one that's near and dear to my heart as a guide is to follow your guide. In particular, when you're in the Great Barrier Reef, one of the animals you probably want to see is the clownfish that made so famous by that movie Finding Nemo, you want to see the Great Barrier Reef clownfish in person. And you can see from this image right here, this very thick coral, an anemone hiding in a little crevice of the coral where this clownfish was residing. Would have missed it entirely if it wasn't for the local snorkel guides there that know this particular individual fish and where to find it. So follow them, see where they're pointing. They're going to always know the best places to look for stuff and where to find all that stuff each time you go out. Now, in addition to the underwater, of course, above the water is that thousands of nesting seabirds, in particular noddies, which are a type of tern, black noddies, brown noddies, and a number of other species that you might find out there. And this is literally just a cell phone picture from outside my cabin door one morning of just all the birds in the tree just outside the cabin. So you can imagine that as a bird photographer, you'd have a field day at a place like this. And so one thing you want to think about here is photographing in aperture priority. So being able to get what's called the bokeh, which is that beautiful fuzzy background you can see on this buff banded rail, which is another prominent resident of Lady Elliot Island. So photographing on aperture priority and changing your aperture to a lower number like f2.8 or f4.5 and getting that beautiful blurred background lends itself to a great portrait of these birds. And in some cases, I've gotten some of these images with my landscape lens because you're able to get close enough because these birds are unfazed by people because they see people visiting regularly to check out the Great Barrier Reef, and they're just these birds living on the island as an aside. So these images right here can be taken using that aperture mode, using a smaller aperture, and you get some lovely portraits of the black noddy. And also shooting with a little bit higher shutter speed, you can get some fantastic flight shots. You get a lot of chances as these birds are flying back and forth. And this landscape, as you saw from some of the pictures and footage, has some sea turtles all over the place. It'd be a rare time snorkeling out there that you're not going to see at least a sea turtle, if not a number of sea turtles. And during the right time of year, in this case, this was in, I believe, March of this year, I was able to see basically the life cycle of the sea turtle, both the mom going up and laying the eggs, little youngsters, the hatchlings coming out at night and heading towards the ocean. This was with a turtle patrol member, so they've got their light there to help those sea turtles head towards the shore or head toward the water's edge and then go for a swim. But then you also see those sea turtles in the water feeding and going about their day. So fantastic place to visit the Great Barrier Reef is right there on Lady Elliot Island. All right, moving from the Great Barrier Reef, we've got the Great Ocean Road, which is on the coast of Victoria, just west of Melbourne, and some beautiful national park area, some stunning coastlines. And you visit those coastlines, you look for wildlife like kangaroos and emus, some interesting waterfalls, as well as another one of our chance to meet some of the Aboriginal locals that will give a cultural presentation on this particular area and all the useful plants and animals that reside there. So when I think about the Great Ocean Road, what I'm actually thinking about oftentimes is water, both between the coastline and then a lot of waterfalls, believe it or not, in that area. So waterfall photography, one of my personal favorites, is really fun to do to try to get that beautiful silky water. You see that on the upper left corner of this particular waterfall in the Otways. To do that, you need to be able to take your camera and turn it to shutter priority or time value if you have a Canon, and you're slowing down that shutter, maybe a half a second, maybe a tenth of a second, something like that. You kind of have to play with it depending on your conditions, a little faster, a little bit slower. And the key here is you got to hold that camera very, very still as you're taking the picture so it doesn't get blurry. The only thing that's blurry is the water moving through the frame. You can actually do this with your smartphone. Smartphone here, you can take a photo. If you've got an iPhone, you use a live picture. You take the photo, and then when you go to edit it, you can switch it to long exposure, and that will get an image very similar to what you see here that was taken with a bigger camera. So I encourage you to look at that. I've written several articles on the Natural Photographer blog, which I'll talk about towards the end of the presentation, specifically about how to take these silky water shots. Also be thinking about you're next to the ocean. You want to worry about protecting your camera with regards to ocean spray, making sure that as you're taking pictures of the shoreline, of the coastline, even if you're not as close to the water as I am in this particular image, just the wind will bring ocean spray up and you can get little salt deposits on your lens. So you be mindful of this, watch for that, and then make sure you clean it off before you get too many pictures that are a little bit blurry and out of focus. You want to make sure that in general, you're not getting too much salt on your camera because that can be quite corrosive, especially to the lens. Little bit of that cleaning solution, wiping it off will help out and do wonders. And you're at the Great Ocean Road, so embrace the road as part of your image. A lot of my photography guests will want to get the most natural looking picture you can, but when in a place that's iconic as this, you want to think about embracing what makes this area unique, which is that road that goes along this Great Ocean coastline. And so there are spots where there's beautiful S-curves and leading lines, and you can get some great shots that way. And as you're going through exploring this landscape, you're seeing what's called the Otway Rainforest, which is it's probably my favorite spot in Australia because the landscape looks like you're walking into Jurassic Park. You've got these tree ferns that look exactly like you'd see in paintings with dinosaurs in them that you'd see at the museum. Every time you go down a trail like the one on the right there, I just expect to see a dinosaur grazing as I come around the corner. Landscapes that can lend themselves to black and whites. Don't be afraid to do that. Take the color away and see what beautiful textures you get. And just enjoy that coastline. All right, moving on to the outback. So in the outback, in particular, this section that I'll be talking about is when we visit the outback as part of the Ultimate Australia Safari, where we're going to the Ikara Flinders Range National Park and Wilpena Pound, that region. And we're seeing some interesting outback wildlife. One of the big ones that are big ticket that we're looking for out there is, of course, the iconic red kangaroo, the largest kangaroo species that we have in Australia. We also see plenty of emus, but we're also looking for other small kangaroo-like relatives, like we've got the rock wallaby in the upper left there, as well as Euros or wallaroos. Exploring this landscape, learning again from the Aboriginal people. It's important to have this cultural component to these trips. So we're headed out to learn from the Akara people about the landscape and how they would have lived here historically and still do to this day. And then staying at a historic sheep ranch or sheep station called Ronsley Park Station, which has the Wilpena Pound rock ridges and mountainous ranges right out your front door. Beautiful place to stay in the outback. Now, when I'm thinking outback, I'm thinking desert photography, of course, and here are some different tips and techniques. Number one is your highlights. As you're taking photos in what will likely be a very sunny area, you want to make sure that you don't have a picture where when you take it, all of it is got all these white edges to it. Like you can see on this emu right here, on the side of its neck, it's very, very bright. It's not fully white, but it could easily be if you're not careful of this. So on your camera, you want to set to what are called the blinkies or zebra display or highlights, depending on your particular camera brand. And what that does, if you can see in that menu on the bottom right there, it'll show the areas that are so white that essentially it's deleted camera space. The camera throws out that data because it's completely white. It doesn't need to save that it's white. It just knows that it's empty camera space. And so you want to make sure that you have that highlighted so that you notice, oh, I'm shooting way too bright to get a good image of this. Then I can change my exposure, maybe increase my shutter speed to make it a little darker, or drop my ISO to make it a little bit darker. Those are all good things to do to make sure you get the image that you're hoping for. And of course, as I alluded to earlier with my camera kit, it's very, very dusty out there. Be mindful of that, especially as we're driving around on the dusty roads. So check your lens often to make sure it's nice and clean. And another super important thing is if you need to change your lens between a wildlife lens and a wide angle landscape lens, be very, very careful not to get dust inside on your sensor. Either do it inside the car, let the dust fully settle. Those are all good things to do. Or if you're able to, bring a second camera body or just your phone to get those landscape shots that might be in the best case for photographing in the outback. And because it's oftentimes quite warm and quite sunny in the outback, you need to worry about where to find the wildlife and how close it's going to be. Oftentimes, those wildlife are going to be in the shade. So, having a longer lens, like a 100 to 200, maybe have a teleconverter to make it a little bit bigger, beefier zoom, or the 200 to 600 that I have in my camera, those are all great options to you to try to get a better image. And you get some fantastic wildlife like this emu, this rock wallaby. You can talk your guide into laying on their back like I did, and then my co-guide Jamie did, and then kick our legs up in the air. And believe it or not, that attracts emus. So you can get them a little closer for some better images and get some great outback landscape shots. Of course, the red kangaroo. And last location is Tasmania. So this is a landscape that is a combination of rugged mountainous landscape as well as some interesting rainforest in the interior. So we have a few things we get a chance to do while we're there. We stay at a tented camp right along the River Derwent, where wildlife are oftentimes like the pattymellons, which are a small kind of wallaby, just hop on by. We visit a few different wildlife sanctuaries there, including Bonarong, which is the one we see here in the center, where they take care of some wildlife in what I consider probably the most extensive rescue and rehabilitation facility and network that I've ever come across. Is right there in Tasmania. Stunning waterfalls, beautiful Cradle Mountain landscape, going down into the caves. In this case, this is Maricopa Cave, and even get a chance to get out on the water and do some kayaking right around areas where you could find platypus right from your boat. So, in particular, when it comes to Tasmania, or Tassie, as it's oftentimes called by the locals, to learn a little bit about how to photograph their wildlife. My first tip is monotremes freeze tag. This is where you have to stay very, very still when it comes to monotremes like our platypus. Not quite a marsupial, a little bit different. There's the platypus and the echidna. They're cousins to each other, collectively known as monotremes. And they actually, when they go underwater, they close their eyes, close their ears, and they're just using their sense of touch and electrical signal sensing, like the sharks, to find food. So when that's the case, you can be as loud as you want above the river on the shoreline. You can run around as much as you want, but the second that platypus comes to the surface, you have to freeze, get your photos very, very quietly so you don't disturb them. Then when they dive back under to go for more feeding, you can move to the next spot, wait for them to pop up, then freeze, take your photos, and then continue on down the river as they do. Same with our echidnas. You want to be talking quieter, moving a lot more stealthily. I'm talking like step, because they can feel that bum, 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 bum of your feet as you move along the ground. So the slower your steps are, the slower you are, the quieter you are, the better chance you can get some fantastic echidna shots like right here. And we're all probably waiting for our wombat photography tip. And the tip is to wait. With wombats, they're constantly grazing. Remember, the grass that they're eating is quite unnutritious, so they have to eat a lot of it in order to get enough food. And so they are constantly having their head on the ground, mowing along. And so it takes a while before you get a picture of a wombat sticking its head up and getting a photo. So a few tips for that. One, you can get low yourself. The lower you are, the better the angle on the head is, so you can get an image like this of that wombat grazing, but you still get the whole body and the head in the photo. You can zoom in and just get the face, which is a great way to get a picture of them while they're grazing. Or look in each of those burrows, check them out, and you might see a wombat sticking its head out like I did here in Cradle Mountain National Park. And speaking of dark areas like wombat burrows, get a chance in Tasmania to go down into the cave system. Here's another great place to use a wide angle because you can zoom way out. That's going to let in a lot more light than a zoom lens, and you can get some great photos of that cave environment. Now, we go into the cave environment to try to get views of the glowworms that are there. Unfortunately, cave regulations, and rightfully so, they don't allow any photography of the glowworms because that light disturbs them when you're trying to take images. And so it gets completely dark so you can see the glowworms, but in other areas of the cave, you can get some great photos using your wide angle lens and getting some lovely formations there. You get great photos of the Tasmanian devil at places like Bonarong and Devils at Cradle, the two sanctuaries we visit while we're there. Lovely waterfalls, like this is Russell Falls in Mount Field National Park. So there we have it, folks. Just as we're nearing the top of the hour, these are our fantastic trips and some tips on how to photograph while you're out there. Australia South, you can see some fantastic wildlife, all the iconic wildlife of Australia in just a short little section. We've got Australia North, which when I talk to Australians, this is the trip they want to go on. This is the trip that Australians want to see the red center and north and west parts of Australia as part of the outback. Ultimate Australia Safari, which does a little bit of everything and gets you, I think, in 21 days, which is our longest trip that NetHab runs, some fantastic views of both the wildlife and the landscapes throughout different regions of Australia. So if you want to learn more or connect with me, you can find me at my website, mikehillmanmedia.com, or an Instagram at my handle @wildventurer. And I also write blog posts for NetHab's photography blog called The Natural Photographer, which is at dailywildlifephoto.nethab.com/photography guide. And this particular one is what's in my camera bag, which where I talk about a lot of the stuff I did during this presentation. All right, with that, Brooke, let's open it up to some questions.
That was fabulous, Mike. Thank you so much. And I'm getting so many comments in here with the
Mm-hmm.
exact same sentiment. Oh, I just got a request for a part two. Oh, you've got your brownies. I was
I gotta
hoping
eat
you
them
were going
after
to get those
making
out.
wombat shaped brownies. I need to eat them.
Yes, that was fantastic. We are near the top of the hour, so I will take a few questions here, but I do have some good ones. I think all of us are asking, and could you, or wondering this, could you please explain why you and Jamie are on your back, and why did that attract
Yeah.
emus? Why did that work?
Yeah, good question. I don't know why it works, but it does. I don't know if it's one of those things like I kind of think of it like, especially with younger dogs, if you make a weird noise they haven't heard before, they like tilt their head and they're trying to get a better listen. As a human, you're standing upright and they're looking at you. You get down on the ground and wiggle your legs in a bicycle kick. That's got to be the weirdest thing an emu's ever seen. And so they like come over to investigate. That's the best idea I have as the explanation of it, but it works wonders. So if you can talk your guide into doing some bicycle kicks for emus, you might get some interesting images that way. At least some good video, if nothing else.
Oh, yes, our guides are definitely the best. You're willing to lay on the ground and kick in the air for a good photo op.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. I do have a photo question here. So,
Hmm.
for the rainforest shots that you were talking about,
Hmm.
what kind of focus do you use? Total spot or flexible spot?
I do flexible. You want to be able to move your spot focus around, and so you're moving it around um, on the camera, like on the back here, using the little button to move it to the exact spot that you want. It works quite well. If you're more comfortable with that fox right in that spot right in the center, so you can get the focus and then recompose and then take the shot, that also works as well.
Great, and one more question here. So, going back to Kangaroo Island, can you talk a little bit more about the wildlife itself? Is all that wildlife wild, meaning they are foraging
Mhm.
on their own, or is
Yep.
there any human intervention on Kangaroo Island?
Yeah, so and in a lot of the places that we visit these sanctuaries where we see some of that wildlife up close, and they're of course part of human care. And in Kangaroo Island, that may be the case. We'll potentially visit a koala sanctuary, depending on the departure. That'll be more like that, where they protect the landscape. The koalas are more or less wild, but generally speaking, all the wildlife that we see on Kangaroo Island is wild. You're visiting national park. You're driving through some very bucolic um, sheep farms, and right along the side of the road, you may see an echidna or some kangaroos hopping by through a grove of trees. Those are all things that happen. To be just like driving around here in the US and seeing some deer next to a farm. We're kind of looking for the same types of wildlife that exist out there: the kangaroos, the echidnas, the koalas, all that.
Perfect. We did just reach the top of the hour. So, Mike, I will turn it to you for any last closing comments.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in and inadvertently potentially celebrating International Wombat Day. But I hope you learned a little bit more about photographing in Australia. Maybe you're interested in going out to Australia or you're already planning to. You'll have a fantastic time. It's a beautiful country with some of the most interesting wildlife in the world. And really, realistically, it's a photographer's playground to be able to photograph all this unique wildlife. So I wish you good luck out there, and thanks for tuning in.
Yes, and thank you, Mike, for giving us such a wonderful presentation today. And I would like to thank everyone who tuned in. Join us tomorrow for our next daily dose of nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.